April 7, 1945, the East China Sea. The largest battleship ever constructed steams toward what its commanders know will be certain death. Aboard the mighty Yamato, all 72,800 tons of her, nearly 3,000 men prepare for battle. But this isn't a battle they expect to win. It's a suicide mission that many of Japan's own admirals believe is utterly futile. What happens next will mark not just the end of a ship, but the end of an era. The final death throes of a naval doctrine that had dominated military thinking for half a century. This is the story of how Japan's admirals, raised on the supremacy of the battleship, came face to face with a new reality they could scarcely believe, that the age of the big gun was over and the age of the aircraft carrier had arrived. To understand the shock and disbelief that would grip Japanese naval commanders when the Yamato went down, we must first understand what this ship meant to them and to Japan itself. The name Yamato was no accident. It referred to the ancient Yamato province, the birthplace of the Japanese imperial court, and had long been used as a poetic name for Japan itself. When the Imperial Japanese Navy christened their super battleship with this sacred name, they weren't just naming a warship. They were creating a symbol of national pride and military supremacy that one Japanese officer described as providing a profound sense of confidence to everyone in the Navy. Construction of the Yamato began in November 1937 at the Kure Naval Arsenal, in conditions of extraordinary secrecy. The dry dock itself had to be specially prepared, deepened by 1 metre and fitted with gantry cranes capable of lifting 350 tons. Workers were required to sign confidentiality agreements. The dry dock was covered with massive rope curtains and screens to prevent aerial observation. Even within the Japanese Navy, only a handful of officers knew the ship's true specifications. The reason for this secrecy was simple. Japan was building something the world had never seen before. The decision to build the Yamato came after Japan withdrew from the Washington Naval Treaty in 1934, which had limited battleship construction to 35,000 tons. Japanese naval planners recognized a fundamental problem. They could never match American industrial output ship for ship. If war came with the United States, Japan would be outnumbered. The solution, they believed, was to build battleships so powerful that each one could take on multiple American ships simultaneously. The Yamato was designed to be the ultimate expression of this philosophy. At 863 feet long, longer than 3 football fields, she would displace nearly 72,000 tons when fully loaded, making her the heaviest battleship ever constructed. But size alone wasn't what made the Yamato revolutionary. It was her armament and protection that truly set her apart. The ship's main battery consisted of 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship. These weren't just incrementally bigger than previous designs, they represented a quantum leap. American and British battleships typically mounted 16-inch guns. The Yamato's weapons were in an entirely different category. Each shell weighed 3,220 pounds, more than a small car, and could penetrate thick armour plate at a distance of over 25 miles. The guns were so powerful that when they fired, the blast could kill exposed personnel on the ship's own deck. The construction of these guns presented enormous challenges. Each complete turret weighed more than an entire 1930s destroyer. They were so massive that they couldn't be transported by conventional means. Japan had to build a special transport ship, the Kashino, specifically designed to carry these guns and turrets to the shipyards where the battleships were being constructed. The design process itself was extraordinarily complex. More than 2 years of work and 23 different blueprint revisions were required before the final plans were approved in March 1937. 50 different ship models were tested in water tanks to determine the most efficient hull form. The Japanese naval architects achieved remarkable results. The unusual hull shape, with its distinctive narrow prow and large bulbous bow, achieved nearly 59% propulsive efficiency at cruising speed, making the massive ship surprisingly fast and economical for her size. The Yamato's armour was equally impressive. Her main belt was 16 inches thick, made of specially developed steel that Japanese metallurgists had worked to make harder and more resistant than anything used by Western navies. The armour deck was 9 inches thick, designed to withstand the plunging fire of enemy battleships at extreme range. The turret faces were a staggering 26 inches thick, the thickest armour ever mounted on a warship. The ship's design incorporated an all-or-nothing armour scheme, concentrating maximum protection around vital areas like magazines, engines, and gun turrets. The Yamato was also surprisingly advanced in other ways. She was the first Japanese warship equipped with air conditioning, making her considerably more comfortable than other vessels, so comfortable that sailors on other ships mockingly called her Hotel Yamato, or the Yamato Hotel. All equipment except propulsion ran on electrical power, requiring generators with a total capacity of 4,800 kilowatts. Her turning ability was better than any battleship in the world in 1941, with minimal heeling even during sharp turns at high speed. Japanese planners had been clever in their strategic calculations. They knew that America's best shipyards were on the East Coast. They also knew that any battleship built to match the Yamato would be too large to pass through the Panama Canal. This meant that even if the United States built a Yamato killer, getting it to the Pacific would require the long journey around South America or through the Suez Canal, a significant strategic delay. In fact, Japanese intelligence had estimated that future American battleships would displace about 35,000 tons and mount 16-inch guns. The actual Iowa-class battleships came close to this, 45,000 tons with 9 16-inch guns, but they still couldn't match the Yamato's firepower or armour. But the Yamato represented more than engineering excellence. She embodied a philosophy that had dominated naval thinking since the late 19th century. The battleship was the ultimate arbiter of naval power. This doctrine held that great fleet actions decided by the big guns of battleships slugging it out at ranges of 15 to 25 miles would determine the course of any naval war. The nation with the most powerful battleships would control the seas. It was a doctrine taught in every naval academy, embodied in the theories of American strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan, and accepted as gospel by naval officers around the world. This belief was particularly strong in Japan, where it was formalized as the Kantai Kessen, or decisive battle doctrine. Japanese naval strategy called for winning a war through a single decisive fleet engagement. In this climactic battle, Japanese battleships would use their superior firepower to smash through the American battle line, achieving victory through qualitative superiority rather than numerical advantage. It was the modern equivalent of Admiral Togo's victory at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, where Japanese battleships had annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet. For Japanese admirals who had come up through the ranks in the 1920s and 1930s, this battleship-centric worldview was not just professional doctrine, it was personal identity. These men had spent their entire careers preparing for the decisive fleet action. Many of them had trained on battleships, commanded battleships, and dreamed of leading battleship fleets into glory. The Yamato represented the culmination of everything they believed about naval warfare. Some Japanese citizens even held the belief that Japan could never fall as long as the Yamato was able to fight. When the Yamato was commissioned on December 16, 1941, just 9 days after Pearl Harbor, she joined her sister ship Musashi to form the most powerful battleship division ever assembled. Together, these two ships were supposed to be the decisive factor that would give Japan control of the Pacific. Japanese planners envisioned a scenario where the American Pacific Fleet would be lured into a decisive engagement, and the Yamato and Musashi would smash through the American battle line with their superior firepower and armor. And yet, the Yamato had even more ambitious siblings planned. Design work had already begun on even larger battleships, the Super Yamato class, also known as Design A-150. These monsters would have displaced over 90,000 tons and mounted either 8 or 9 20.1-inch guns in their main battery. These would have been the largest guns ever fitted to a warship, dwarfing even the Yamato's 18.1-inch weapons. The armor-piercing shells alone would have weighed over 4,300 pounds. Design work was largely complete by 1941, and 2 ships were tentatively scheduled for construction. But the war intervened, and these ultimate battleships would never be built. The resources and shipyard space were diverted to other, more urgent needs, particularly aircraft carriers. This reveals an important irony. Even as Japan was building the ultimate expression of battleship supremacy, the nature of naval warfare was already changing in ways that would make these ships obsolete before they ever fired their guns in anger. The warning signs were there from the very beginning, but many Japanese admirals chose not to see them, or couldn't allow themselves to believe what they were seeing. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, sinking or damaging 8 American battleships. It was a stunning vindication of naval aviation and a demonstration that aircraft carriers, not battleships, might be the dominant weapon of modern naval warfare. Yet even this triumph contained a bitter irony. The very success of the Pearl Harbor attack was achieved by officers who had fought for years against the battleship-dominated establishment to build up Japan's carrier force. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, was one of the few senior Japanese admirals who truly understood the potential of naval aviation. He had served as a naval attaché in the United States and had watched American aviation development closely. Yamamoto had argued passionately for expanding Japan's carrier fleet, often facing resistance from battleship advocates within the Navy. He famously recognized that air power would dominate the coming war, understanding that the days of battleship supremacy were numbered. But even Yamamoto couldn't fully escape the psychological pull of the battleship. When he made the Yamato his flagship in February 1942, he was making a symbolic statement about where ultimate naval power still resided, at least in the eyes of tradition. The contradiction was stark. The admiral who best understood the obsolescence of the battleship chose to command from the world's largest battleship. It was Yamamoto who would command from the Yamato's bridge during the Battle of Midway in June 1942, a catastrophic defeat for Japan that would be decided entirely by carrier aircraft, with battleships playing no role whatsoever. The first year of the Pacific War seemed to confirm that something fundamental had changed in naval warfare. In May 1942, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, two carrier forces fought the first naval battle in history, where the surface ships never came within sight of each other. Everything was decided by aircraft: scouts, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. Not a single shell was fired between surface ships. The age-old ritual of battleship versus battleship combat simply didn't happen. Then came Midway. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. The battle was an unmitigated disaster for Japan, and again, battleships played no decisive role. The Yamato was there, part of Yamamoto's main body, but she never got close enough to fire her guns at anything. The battle was won and lost by aircraft, demonstrating beyond doubt that carriers had become the capital ships of modern naval warfare. But perhaps the most shocking demonstration of air power's supremacy came in December 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor. The British battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse were sunk by Japanese land-based aircraft off the coast of Malaya. These weren't outdated pre-dreadnoughts sitting at anchor in shallow water, like at Pearl Harbor. These were modern, powerful warships. The Prince of Wales was barely 6 months old, underway at sea, taking evasive manoeuvres and fighting back with everything they had. The Prince of Wales had recently carried Prime Minister Winston Churchill to his meeting with President Roosevelt, and was considered one of Britain's most powerful ships, and they went down in a matter of hours, overwhelmed by aerial torpedo attacks. The sinking of the Prince of Wales and Repulse sent shockwaves through the naval establishments of both Allied and Axis powers. Churchill later wrote that he was dazed by the news. The lesson was clear to those willing to see it. No battleship, no matter how powerful, could survive sustained attack by modern aircraft without air cover of its own. The era when a battleship could operate independently, relying on its armour and anti-aircraft guns for protection, was over. Despite these warning signs, many Japanese admirals clung to the belief that battleships still had a decisive role to play. They argued that the battles thus far had been fought at extreme ranges, in situations where battleships couldn't bring their guns to bear. They believed that in a close-range night action, or in a battle where air power was neutralized by bad weather or darkness, battleships would prove their worth. They pointed out that the Yamato and Musashi were far more heavily armoured than the Prince of Wales, and theoretically better protected against air attack. Their anti-aircraft armament was formidable, over 150 guns of various calibers, including special anti-aircraft shells for the main guns that could burst in mid-air and spray shrapnel over a wide area. There was some logic to this thinking. Modern naval warfare is complex, and there were scenarios where battleships could still be effective. In the confusion of night combat, or in the restricted waters around island chains, battleships could provide devastating fire support. But this represented a dramatic reduction in expectations. The battleship had gone from being the decisive weapon of naval warfare to being a useful tool in limited circumstances. The decisive fleet action that Japanese doctrine called for, the modern Tsushima, was looking less and less likely to ever happen. The reality was that institutional inertia and personal psychology made it difficult for many officers to accept how fundamentally warfare had changed. These were men who had devoted their lives to mastering the art of battleship combat. Their promotions, their reputations, their entire professional identities were tied to the battleship. To accept that carriers had made battleships obsolete was to accept that their life's work had become irrelevant. It's not surprising that many resisted this conclusion with every fibre of their being. Throughout 1942 and 1943, the Yamato remained largely inactive, a fleet in being that was too valuable to risk in combat. She spent most of her time anchored at Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands, a safe harbour far from American forces. Sailors jokingly referred to her as Hotel Yamato because of her relative comfort and inaction. It was a humiliating existence for the crew of what was supposed to be the most powerful warship in the world. Here was a ship that had cost a fortune to build, that represented the pinnacle of naval architecture, that was supposed to be the decisive weapon of the Pacific War, and she spent her days swinging at anchor, her massive guns silent. The Yamato's sister ship Musashi had an equally frustrating war. Both ships were held back, reserved for the decisive fleet action that never came. Japanese commanders were caught in a strategic paradox. The ships were too valuable to risk in ordinary engagements, but the decisive engagement for which they were being saved never materialized on favorable terms. The longer they waited, the weaker Japan's overall naval position became, as carrier losses mounted and American industrial production began to overwhelm Japanese forces. When the Yamato did finally see action, it was anticlimactic. In June 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Yamato was part of a major Japanese fleet operation. But the battle, known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was decided entirely by carrier aircraft. American fighters slaughtered Japanese air groups, shooting down approximately 600 Japanese aircraft over 2 days while losing only 123 of their own planes. The disparity was staggering. American carrier pilots were better trained, flew superior aircraft, and benefited from radar-directed fighter control that allowed them to intercept Japanese formations before they could reach the American fleet. The Yamato fired her anti-aircraft guns but never engaged enemy surface ships. Her massive main battery, which had cost so much to develop and build, which represented decades of naval architecture research and development, which could hurl 3,000-pound shells over 25 miles, all of it remained silent. The guns that were supposed to decide the fate of the Pacific War never fired at an enemy ship. It was a bitter revelation of irrelevance. The battle was a disaster for Japan on every level. The loss of so many aircraft and trained pilots was devastating, but it was also a revelation about the new reality of naval warfare. The sheer dominance of American carrier aviation was overwhelming. Without control of the air, Japanese surface ships, including the mighty Yamato, were helpless. They could defend themselves to some extent with anti-aircraft fire, but they couldn't strike back effectively. They certainly couldn't accomplish their primary mission of bringing their big guns to bear on enemy ships. 3 months later, in October 1944, came the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history and the last major engagement where battleships would fight battleships. The battle was actually a series of separate engagements spread across 3 days, and it showcased both the dying gasps of battleship warfare and the final proof of carrier supremacy. In one phase of the battle, in the Surigao Strait, American battleships crossed the T of an attacking Japanese force and devastated them with gunfire. A classic battleship engagement that could have come from any point in the previous 50 years. It was the culmination of everything those battleship captains had trained for their entire careers. Most of the American battleships that fought at Surigao were veterans of Pearl Harbor, repaired and returned to service. They were getting their revenge. But this engagement was notable precisely because it was the last time such a thing would ever happen. It was the last battleship versus battleship engagement in history, the end of an era playing out in the darkness of Surigao Strait. The Yamato participated in a different phase of the battle, attempting to attack American landing forces at Leyte. For a few hours, it seemed like she might actually accomplish what she was designed to do. The American escort carriers off Samar were vulnerable, protected only by destroyers and destroyer escorts. If the Yamato and her accompanying ships could reach them, they could wreak havoc. But American destroyer crews fought with desperate courage, launching torpedo attacks and laying smoke screens, and American carrier aircraft struck again and again. The Yamato came under attack by American carrier aircraft and was hit by 2 bombs, but her heavy armour protected her and the damage was relatively minor. However, she was turned back. She withdrew without ever engaging enemy surface ships, her mission unfulfilled. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was a catastrophic defeat for Japan on a scale hard to comprehend. They lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, including the Musashi, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, and the Musashi's fate was particularly ominous for anyone paying attention. On October 24, 1944, the Musashi came under sustained attack by American carrier aircraft in the Sibuyan Sea. Wave after wave of bombers and torpedo planes struck the massive battleship. The first attacks achieved little. The Musashi's armour held and she fought back viciously with her anti-aircraft guns. Her crew fought magnificently, controlling damage, maintaining speed, and keeping their guns firing. But the Americans kept coming. They had learned from experience, and they coordinated their attacks carefully, hitting from multiple directions simultaneously to divide the defensive fire. Over the course of several hours, the Musashi was hit by an estimated 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. Even her massive armour couldn't withstand such a sustained pounding. The torpedoes were particularly devastating. American torpedo bombers were instructed to concentrate their attacks on one side of the ship, making it impossible for damage control teams to counter-flood effectively and restore balance. As water flooded into the hull on one side, the ship began to list more and more severely. Eventually, the list became unrecoverable. At 7:35 p.m., the Musashi capsized and sank, taking more than 1,000 men with her. The Musashi's sinking should have been the final proof that no battleship, no matter how powerful, could survive without air cover against sustained aerial attack. The ship had been hit more times than the Prince of Wales and Repulse combined. Her armour had allowed her to survive far longer. She had remained afloat and fighting for hours under attacks that would have sunk lesser ships in minutes. But the end result was the same. Superior armour just meant it took more bombs and torpedoes to sink you. It didn't make you invulnerable. It didn't change the fundamental equation that aircraft carriers now ruled the seas. Yet even this didn't fully convince all Japanese commanders. Some argued that the Musashi had been unlucky, or that with better anti-aircraft defences and better damage control she might have survived. Some pointed out that the Yamato herself had survived air attack at Leyte. The capacity for denial remained strong, fueled by desperation and by the psychological need to believe that the skills and ships they had devoted their lives to still mattered. By early 1945, Japan's strategic situation was desperate beyond any hope of recovery. American forces had captured the Philippines and were preparing to invade Okinawa, just 400 miles from the Japanese home islands. The Imperial Japanese Navy was shattered. Following the Solomon Islands campaign, the Battle of the Philippine Sea and the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the once formidable combined fleet was reduced to a handful of operational warships. Most of Japan's carriers had been sunk, and even if they still existed, there were almost no trained pilots left to fly from them. The Army and Navy air forces had been devastated by years of attrition. Experienced pilots who had trained for years before the war were dead, replaced by hastily trained recruits who stood little chance against veteran American pilots flying superior aircraft. Japan was losing the war, and everyone knew it. The American invasion of Okinawa began on April 1, 1945. In March, when briefing Emperor Hirohito on Japan's response to the invasion, Japanese military leaders explained that the Imperial Army was planning extensive air attacks, including kamikaze strikes. The Emperor reportedly asked, "But what about the Navy? What are they doing to assist in defending Okinawa?" It was a question that cut to the heart of the Navy's dilemma. What could the Navy do? Its carriers were gone. Its air groups were decimated. Most of its cruisers and destroyers had been sunk. The Navy still had one card to play, the Yamato and a handful of escorts, but everyone knew that sending them out without air cover would be suicide. In this context of desperation, the Japanese High Command prepared Operation Tengo, the Navy's response to the Emperor's question. The plan was extraordinary in its futility. The Yamato, along with the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, would sortie from Japan, break through to Okinawa, and bombard the American landing forces. Once there, the ships would deliberately beach themselves and use their guns as stationary artillery until they were destroyed. The crews would then fight as naval infantry until killed. It was a suicide mission from start to finish, designed not to achieve victory but to demonstrate that the Navy was doing something, anything, to defend Okinawa. Not everyone agreed with this plan. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, who was assigned to command the operation, objected strongly. Ito was a respected officer, a battleship commander who nevertheless understood the realities of modern naval warfare. He had seen what American air power could do. He knew that sending the Yamato on this mission was throwing away thousands of lives for no military purpose. He reportedly called it a meaningless death, and argued that the ships and men should be preserved for the defense of the home islands, where they might actually accomplish something useful. Other officers shared Ito's views. Captain Atsushi Oi, an operations officer at Grand Escort Command, was particularly vocal in his criticism. When told that the operation was necessary for the tradition and the glory of the Navy, he exploded in anger. "This war is of our nation, and why should the honour of our surface fleet be more respected? Who cares about their glory? Damn fools!" It was an extraordinary outburst, a rejection of the very ethos that had dominated Japanese naval thinking for decades. But it reflected what many officers were thinking privately, that this operation was a pointless waste driven by symbolism rather than strategy. But the decision came from the highest levels of the Japanese military command, driven more by psychology and honour than by rational military calculation. The Yamato represented the pride of the Imperial Navy. To let her sit in port while the battle for Japan's survival raged at Okinawa was seen as unacceptable by senior commanders. Even if she would achieve nothing militarily, she had to sail. It was a decision driven by the psychology of desperation and the need to be seen as fighting to the last. Admiral Toyoda Soemu, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, gave the order. When Ito continued to object, Vice Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka flew from Tokyo to Tokuyama on April 5th in a final attempt to convince Ito and the other commanders to accept the plan. The meeting was contentious. The captains initially rejected the operation unanimously as a waste of lives and resources, but Kusaka played his trump card. He told them that the Emperor himself expected the Navy to make its best effort. Faced with a direct invocation of the Emperor's will, the commanders accepted the plan. In the hierarchical, honour-bound culture of the Japanese military, there was no other choice once the Emperor's wishes were invoked. The Yamato was given only enough fuel for a one-way trip. This detail has often been cited as evidence of how desperate Japan's situation was. They didn't even have enough fuel for a round trip, but in reality this didn't matter. The mission was designed to be one way from the beginning. The Yamato wasn't expected to come back. The ship was to beach herself at Okinawa and fight until destroyed. Fuel for the return journey was irrelevant. According to some accounts, in a small act of defiance, the personnel at Tokuyama actually gave the Yamato and her escorts almost all the remaining fuel at the port, more than officially authorised, though this still probably wasn't enough for a round trip. On the evening of April 5th, the ship's executive officer organised a party for the crew. Many of the officers and sailors drank heavily, knowing what lay ahead. Approximately 80 crew members who were new, sick or infirm were ordered off the ships, including 67 naval cadets who had arrived just days earlier. These young men, barely out of training, were spared from the suicide mission. But when the rest of the crew was told about the mission, and given the chance to stay behind, not a single man took it. They would sail to their deaths with their ship and their admiral. On April 6, 1945, at 4 p.m, the Yamato and her escorts departed from Tokuyama, heading south toward Okinawa. Aboard the great battleship, the mood was somber but determined. The crew had been told they weren't expected to return. Some officers and men had written final letters to their families, others engaged in traditional preparations for death. Admiral Ito himself had no illusions about what lay ahead. He reportedly told his staff, "This will be my death place." But he would lead his men with the dignity expected of a Japanese admiral, even in a mission he believed was futile. The force consisted of the Yamato, the light cruiser Yahagi, and 8 destroyers: Asashimo, Hamakaze, Isokaze, Kasumi, Fuyutsuki, Suzutsuki, Yukikaze, and Hatsushimo. It was a pitifully small force to send against the massive American fleet at Okinawa, a fleet that included 11 fleet carriers and hundreds of other ships. But it was all Japan had left. The Americans knew the Yamato was coming almost from the moment she left port. US submarines, Threadfin and Hackleback spotted the Japanese force steaming through Bungo Suido Strait between Shikoku and Honshu, and immediately reported their position and course. The Americans also had a significant intelligence advantage. They had broken Japanese naval codes years earlier and had been reading Japanese communications throughout the war. They knew about Operation Tengo before it even began. There would be no surprise, no chance of the Yamato slipping through undetected. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the US Fifth Fleet at Okinawa, immediately began preparing a response. The American plan was straightforward and overwhelming. Use carrier aircraft to sink the Yamato before she could reach Okinawa. It was what the Americans had become very good at over years of Pacific combat, using massive air power to destroy enemy ships. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, the fast carrier task force, would handle the operation. That night, the flight crews of Task Force 58 were informed that the Yamato was coming. In the hangar decks of the American carriers, crews worked through the night preparing aircraft, loading torpedoes on the Avenger torpedo bombers for the first time since training exercises. Everyone understood the significance. They were about to attack the largest battleship in the world, a ship that many of them had heard about through intelligence reports but never seen. This was going to be one of the great aerial attacks of the war. At dawn on April 7, 1945, the Japanese force passed the Osumi Peninsula into the open ocean, heading south from Kyushu toward Okinawa. They shifted into a defensive formation, with the Ahagi leading the Yamato and the 8 destroyers deployed in a ring around the 2 larger ships, each vessel about 1,500 meters from the others. They proceeded at 20 knots. Almost immediately, one of the destroyers, a Sashimo, developed engine trouble and had to turn back, an ominous start to the operation. First, the Japanese force turned southwest, as if headed for Sasebo, trying to throw off the submarines they knew were shadowing them. But at 11:30 a.m., after being detected by 2 American PBM Mariner flying boats, they turned back south toward Okinawa. The Yamato fired a salvo with her massive 18.1-inch bowguns using special beehive shells, the Sanshiki anti-aircraft rounds that burst in midair and sprayed shrapnel over a wide area. But she couldn't prevent the American planes from shadowing the force and reporting its every move. On the morning of April 7th, American search planes located the Japanese force about 200 miles north of Okinawa. The weather was poor, overcast with low clouds and occasional rain squalls. In an earlier era of naval warfare, such conditions might have provided significant protection, but they weren't enough to hide a 70,000-ton battleship from radar-equipped search planes. At 10 a.m., the first wave of American aircraft began taking off from their carriers. In total, nearly 400 aircraft would participate in the attack. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers from multiple carrier groups. It was an overwhelming force, far more than necessary to sink any ship afloat. But the Americans weren't taking chances. They knew they were attacking the most powerful battleship in the world, and they were going to make absolutely certain she went down. The American strike force included dozens of TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, each armed with a 2,000-pound torpedo. They were joined by SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, carrying 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs, and F-6F Hellcat fighters to provide escort and strafe the Japanese ships. These were the elite squadrons of the US fast carrier force, battle-hardened veterans of campaigns stretching back years. They knew their business. The crew of the Yamato spotted the American planes at around 12:30 p.m. Admiral Ito ordered his ships to prepare for battle. The Yamato's anti-aircraft guns, over 150 weapons ranging from 25 mm machine guns to 125 dual-purpose guns, opened fire. The noise must have been deafening, a continuous roar of gunfire as the battleship threw up a wall of flak against the incoming attackers. Tracers arced through the sky. Shells burst in the air, creating clouds of shrapnel. The escorts added their own fire, creating a storm of anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky around the Japanese force. The Japanese fought back with ferocious determination. The Yamato's anti-aircraft fire was intense, and she had those special Sanshiki anti-aircraft shells for her main guns, 18.1-inch shells that would burst in the air and spray shrapnel over a wide area. These were fired at approaching aircraft formations, creating massive explosions that must have been terrifying for attacking pilots. Several American planes were hit and went down, but it wasn't enough. It could never have been enough against the swarm of aircraft that descended on the Japanese force. The Americans had refined their attack tactics through years of combat. They came in from multiple directions simultaneously, dividing the defenders' fire. Torpedo bombers came in low from both sides, skimming just above the wave tops to avoid anti-aircraft fire for as long as possible. Dive bombers attacked from above, plunging down through the flak to release their bombs at low altitude before pulling up. It was a coordinated assault that no ship, no matter how powerful, could defend against effectively. The Americans had learned from the Musashi's sinking. They concentrated their torpedo attacks on one side of the ship, trying to cause listing that would make damage control impossible. If you hit a ship evenly on both sides, the crew can counterflood compartments on the opposite side to maintain balance. But if you concentrate your hits on one side, the ship develops a list that becomes progressively harder to correct as more water floods in. The first torpedo hit the Yamato on her port side at around 12:45 p.m., then another and another. The Americans kept coming. Bombs struck the superstructure and deck, starting fires and destroying anti-aircraft positions. Each hit reduced the ship's ability to defend herself. The torpedo damage was catastrophic. Despite her heavy torpedo defense system, the most sophisticated ever designed, the sheer number of hits overwhelmed her protective measures. Within the first wave of attacks, the Yamato took at least 5 torpedo hits, all concentrated on the port side as planned. The ship began to list to port as thousands of tons of water flooded into ruptured compartments. Damage control teams worked frantically to counter-flood compartments on the starboard side, trying to restore balance. For a while, they succeeded in reducing the list from 15 degrees down to 5 or 6 degrees. But it was a losing battle. The second wave of American aircraft arrived around 1 p.m., and the attacks intensified. More torpedoes slammed into the port side. More bombs crashed through the deck armour or exploded against the superstructure. The Yamato's anti-aircraft fire was still intense. Her gunners continued fighting with desperate courage, but the sheer number of attacking aircraft was overwhelming. Planes were everywhere, coming from all directions at once. One bomb penetrated the main deck armour and exploded inside the ship, causing massive internal damage and fires. Another hit near one of the after turrets. The great battleship was being systematically torn apart. Her speed dropped as engine rooms flooded. Steering became increasingly difficult as rudder controls were damaged. Fires spread through the upper works, and still the Americans came. The light cruiser Yahagi, steaming ahead of the Yamato, was also taking terrible punishment. She was hit by at least 12 bombs and 7 torpedoes in rapid succession. Unlike the heavily armoured Yamato, the Yahagi had relatively thin armour designed for speed rather than protection. The hits were devastating. By 2 p.m., the Yahagi was dead in the water, listing heavily and on fire. She would sink shortly afterward, taking most of her crew with her. 3 of the escorting destroyers, Isokaze, Hamikaze and Kasumi, were also sunk by the aerial assault. The remaining destroyers, damaged themselves, could do little to help the Yamato. They fired their anti-aircraft guns and attempted to shield the battleship with smoke screens, but against hundreds of aircraft such efforts were futile. By 2 p.m, the Yamato had taken at least 10 torpedo hits, almost all on the port side plus numerous bomb hits. The list to port was approaching 20 degrees and getting worse. The ship was down by the bow with water, flooding forward compartments. Speed had dropped to barely 7 knots. Counter-flooding efforts had failed. There simply wasn't enough intact compartment space on the starboard side to balance the massive water ingress on the port side. In the command centre, Admiral Ito and Captain Kosaku Aruga faced the inevitable conclusion. The Yamato was doomed. The ship that was supposed to be unsinkable, the ultimate expression of battleship supremacy, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, she was going down, destroyed by the very weapon system that many admirals had dismissed as secondary to the battleship. At around 2:05 p.m, with the list approaching critical levels, Admiral Ito gave his final orders. He released the Emperor's portrait, the sacred image that was kept aboard every Japanese warship, to be transferred to a destroyer for safekeeping. This was a formal acknowledgement that the ship was lost. According to tradition and several accounts, Ito then shook hands with Captain Aruga and retired to his cabin, choosing to go down with his ship in accordance with naval tradition. Aruga remained on the bridge, commanding the damage control efforts to the end. The order was given to abandon ship, but by this point it was too late for most of the crew. The ship was listing so severely that it was nearly impossible to move around on deck. Men slid down the tilting deck into the water. Others were trapped below decks as compartments flooded. The destroyers moved in close, trying to rescue survivors, but they had to be careful. The Yamato could capsize at any moment, and the suction from a ship that size going down could pull nearby vessels underwater. At 2:20 p.m, the list reached 35 degrees to port. The massive ship was rolling over. Men jumped or were thrown into the sea. Some managed to swim clear. Many didn't. And then came the final catastrophe. At 2:23 p.m, the Yamato capsized completely and exploded. The explosion was beyond anything the witnesses had imagined possible. It was massive, so large that it was seen by ships over 100 miles away and created a mushroom cloud that rose 6,000 feet into the air, visible from the American carriers over the horizon. The explosion was likely caused by the main magazine detonating, releasing the energy equivalent to hundreds of tons of explosives. One moment the great battleship was there, rolling over in her death throes. The next moment there was only a tower of fire and smoke reaching into the sky. The shock wave from the explosion was so powerful that American pilots flying overhead felt their aircraft buffeted by the blast. On the destroyers nearby, sailors were knocked off their feet. The sea boiled with burning oil and debris. Where the Yamato had been, there was now only wreckage and dying men struggling in the water. Of the 2,967 men aboard the Yamato, only 269 survived, less than 10%. Admiral Ito went down with his ship, as did Captain Aruga. Most of the crew died in the explosion or drowned in the minutes that followed. The surviving destroyers rescued what few men they could find, and then their mission failed, and their flagship destroyed, turned north and limped back to Japan. The light cruiser Yahagi and 4 of the 8 destroyers were also sunk in the engagement: Asashimo, Hamakaze, Isakaze, and Kasumi. In total, the Japanese lost over 4,000 men in the operation. The surviving destroyers, Fuyutsuki, Suzutsuki, Yukikaze, and Hatsushimo, were all damaged, some heavily. The entire operation had achieved nothing militarily. Not a single American ship was damaged in the engagement. 10 American aircraft were lost to anti-aircraft fire, a remarkably small number given the intensity of the attack. The Yamato never came within 200 miles of the American forces at Okinawa. She never fired her main guns at an enemy ship. The decisive battleship engagement that Japanese naval doctrine had called for, that the Yamato had been designed to win, never happened. Instead, the world's most powerful battleship was destroyed by aircraft, just like the Prince of Wales, just like the Musashi, just like every other battleship that had ventured within range of enemy air power without adequate air cover. When news of the Yamato's sinking reached Japanese naval headquarters, the reaction was one of shock, profound grief, and for many a kind of disbelief that bordered on denial. For admirals of the old school, particularly those who had devoted their careers to battleship warfare, the loss was more than just the sinking of a ship. It was the destruction of everything they had believed about naval power. Some Japanese officers reportedly refused to believe the initial reports. How could the Yamato have been sunk? She was supposed to be unsinkable, protected by the thickest armour ever mounted on a warship, defended by over 150 anti-aircraft guns, designed specifically to withstand attack. The cognitive dissonance was enormous. These were men who had been trained from their earliest days in the Navy to believe in the supremacy of the battleship, who had built their entire professional understanding of warfare around the big gun and heavy armour. The idea that all of that could be rendered obsolete by aircraft seemed impossible, unthinkable. But the evidence was undeniable. The Yamato was gone, destroyed by the very weapon system that many conservative admirals had viewed as secondary to the battleship. The destruction of the Yamato was the final, irrefutable proof that the age of the battleship was over. No amount of armour, no matter how thick, could protect a ship from sustained aerial attack. No anti-aircraft battery, no matter how numerous, could stop hundreds of attacking aircraft. The fundamental equation of naval warfare had changed, and the battleship had lost its place at the centre. This realization came at different times for different officers. Some, like Admiral Yamamoto, had understood years earlier that air power had changed everything. Others, particularly younger officers who had more exposure to aviation, had accepted this reality after Pearl Harbor or Midway, or the Battle of the Philippine Sea. But for some of the old guard, the battleship admirals who had spent decades perfecting their craft, The sinking of the Yamato was the moment when they could no longer deny the truth. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Imagine dedicating your entire life to mastering a craft, rising through the ranks based on your expertise, achieving respect and authority based on your knowledge, only to watch that craft become obsolete before your eyes. Imagine believing deeply in a set of principles and doctrines, having those beliefs reinforced by decades of institutional culture and tradition, only to see those principles proven catastrophically wrong. For some Japanese admirals, the sinking of the Yamato must have felt like the collapse of their entire worldview. The personal accounts from survivors and from officers who learned of the sinking paint a picture of profound shock. Some officers wept openly, others sat in stunned silence. The Yamato had been more than just a ship. She had been a symbol of Japanese naval power, a source of national pride, a physical embodiment of the idea that Japanese quality could overcome American quantity. The belief that, as long as the Yamato exists, Japan cannot fall had been widespread. Now that belief lay shattered. There was also a deep sense of waste and anger among some officers. Vice Admiral Ito had been right. This had been a meaningless death. Nearly 3,000 men had died for nothing, sent on a suicide mission that everyone knew would fail, sacrificed not for military necessity, but for symbolism and honour. Captain Atsushi Oi's angry words, "Damn fools!" echoed what many were thinking but didn't dare say openly. The operation had accomplished nothing except to demonstrate that the Navy was willing to fight to the death, even when fighting meant pointless suicide. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that many Japanese naval officers had seen this coming, but were unable to change course. The warning signs had been there for years. Pearl Harbor had demonstrated the power of carrier aviation. The sinking of the Prince of Wales and Repulse had shown that battleships were vulnerable to air attack. Midway had proven that carriers were the decisive weapon of modern naval warfare. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had demonstrated American carrier supremacy. The Musashi's sinking had shown that even the most heavily armoured battleship could be overwhelmed by sustained air attack. But institutional inertia, personal psychology, and cultural factors had prevented the necessary adaptation. The battleship doctrine was so deeply embedded in Japanese naval thinking, so central to the identity of the officer corps, that it survived long after the evidence showed it was wrong. Resources continued to be poured into battleships, even after it became clear that carriers were more important. The Yamato was held back, waiting for the decisive battle that would never come, even as Japan's carrier force was being destroyed, and in the end, when there were no good options left, she was sent on a suicide mission that everyone knew would fail. In the aftermath of the war, as Japan rebuilt and reflected on what had happened, the Yamato took on new meanings. She became a symbol not just of military power, but of tragedy, of noble failure, of the futility of refusing to adapt to changing circumstances. The story of the Yamato resonated deeply in Japanese culture. The beautiful, powerful ship, sent on a mission everyone knew was hopeless, destroyed in a final futile gesture. The wreck of the Yamato lies today in about 1,120 feet of water in the East China Sea, approximately 180 miles southwest of Kyushu. She was located in 1985, lying upside down on the ocean floor, broken into several large pieces. The main section is inverted, with the bow separated and lying some distance away. The enormous explosion that destroyed her had broken the ship's back. Japanese authorities have designated the wreck site as a war grave, and it is illegal to disturb it. Over the decades since the war, the Yamato has been the subject of numerous books, films, documentaries, and even anime. She has become perhaps the most famous battleship in history, known even to people who have no particular interest in naval warfare. This fame is ironic. She achieved in death the renown that eluded her in life. During the war she accomplished little, fired her main guns in anger only once, at Samar during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and then ineffectively, and spent most of her service swinging at anchor. Yet she is remembered while more successful ships are forgotten. Part of this enduring fascination stems from the sheer scale and power of the ship. The Yamato was genuinely extraordinary from an engineering standpoint, the largest, most powerful battleship ever built, incorporating innovations and capabilities that were remarkable even by today's standards. The 18.1-inch guns remain the largest naval rifles ever deployed. The armour scheme was the most sophisticated ever designed. In purely technical terms, the Yamato was a masterpiece. But the deeper fascination, particularly in Japan, comes from what the ship represents symbolically. The Yamato embodies a certain kind of tragedy, the tragedy of magnificent effort wasted, of power rendered irrelevant by changing circumstances, of courage and sacrifice expended in a futile cause. She represents the old Japan, the Japan of samurai values and Bushido, fighting against a new reality it couldn't accept and couldn't defeat. In that sense, the Yamato story is a microcosm of Japan's entire experience in World War II. For naval historians and military strategists, the Yamato remains a case study in the dangers of fighting the last war, of allowing doctrine to ossify, and of confusing technological sophistication with strategic relevance. The ship was technologically superior to any battleship the Allies built. No one disputes that. But technological superiority in an obsolete weapons system doesn't matter much. It's like having the finest suit of plate armor in the age of gunpowder, or the sharpest cavalry saber in the age of machine guns. The technology is impressive, but it's solving the wrong problem. The lesson extends far beyond naval warfare. In any field, military, business, technology, politics, there's a constant tension between established doctrine and new possibilities. Those who have invested decades in mastering a particular approach naturally resist the suggestion that their expertise has become obsolete. Organizations develop cultures and structures around particular ways of doing things, and these become resistant to change even in the face of clear evidence that change is necessary. The battleship admirals of World War II weren't stupid or incompetent. Many of them were brilliant officers who had spent their lives studying warfare at the highest levels. But they were psychologically and professionally invested in a particular paradigm, and that investment made it difficult, sometimes impossible, to accept that the paradigm had changed. They saw what they expected to see, interpreted ambiguous evidence in ways that confirmed their existing beliefs, and found reasons to discount or dismiss information that contradicted their worldview. This is human nature, and it's something that affects all of us, not just naval officers in the 1940s. Some officers adapted. Admiral Yamato, despite commanding from the Yamato, understood that carriers were now supreme. Younger officers, who hadn't spent their entire careers focused on battleships, adapted more readily. But for many of the old guard, accepting the obsolescence of the battleship meant accepting that their life's work had become irrelevant, and that was psychologically impossible. So they held on to the old doctrine, looked for scenarios where battleships might still be decisive, and convinced themselves that the next battle might vindicate their beliefs. The sinking of the Yamato was the moment when this denial became impossible to sustain, when the most powerful battleship in the world, protected by the thickest armor ever mounted on a warship, defended by over 150 anti-aircraft guns, could be sent to the bottom in just over 2 hours by carrier aircraft. There was no ambiguity left, no room for alternative interpretations. The age of the battleship was over, the age of the carrier had arrived, and the officers who had built their careers and identities around the battleship had to somehow come to terms with this new reality. The story of the Yamato and the admirals who couldn't believe she was sunk by planes is ultimately a human story, a story about belief, identity, and the difficulty of change. It's about what happens when the foundations of your professional life are pulled out from under you, when everything you thought you knew turns out to be wrong, when the skills you spent decades perfecting become obsolete in a matter of years. Some of those Japanese admirals who learned of the Yamato's sinking probably did experience genuine disbelief, at least initially. Not because they were foolish, but because accepting the truth meant accepting something profoundly painful. That the world had changed, that their expertise no longer mattered in the way it once had, that the decisive fleet engagement they had trained for their entire careers would never happen. Others probably felt something closer to resignation. They'd seen the warning signs, had watched the carrier prove its dominance again and again, and the Yamato's sinking was just the final confirmation of what they already knew but had been trying not to fully acknowledge. For them, the shock wasn't so much surprise as it was the finality of it, the closing of a chapter, the end of an era. And some probably felt anger, not at the Americans who had sunk the ship, but at the Japanese leadership that had sent her on such a futile mission, that had thrown away thousands of lives for nothing more than symbolic gesture. The anger of knowing that Ito had been right, that this was a meaningless death, that these men could have been saved for missions where they might actually accomplish something. Whatever they felt individually, collectively, the sinking of the Yamato marked a watershed moment, It was the final, irrefutable proof that battleships were obsolete, that carrier aviation had revolutionized naval warfare, and that no amount of armor or firepower could change this fundamental reality. The admirals who had grown up in the age of the battleship had to watch that age die, and some of them died with it, psychologically if not literally. April 7th, 1945 was the day when the last battleship sent into combat on a primary mission was destroyed by air power. There would be battleships in future conflicts. They would provide shore bombardment in Korea and Vietnam. They would fire cruise missiles in the Gulf War, but they would never again be sent as the primary striking force of a fleet. That era ended when the Yamato capsized in the East China Sea, her magazines exploding in a pillar of fire visible for 100 miles. The admirals who couldn't believe it had happened weren't denying a simple fact. They were struggling with the death of a worldview, the obsolescence of their life's work, the end of everything they had believed about how naval warfare should be conducted. In that sense, their disbelief was entirely human, entirely understandable, and deeply, profoundly tragic. The Yamato went down fighting. Her crew fought with courage and determination until the very end. But they were fighting a battle that had already been decided, using weapons that had already been made obsolete by the march of technology and the evolution of warfare. The massive guns that could hurl 3,000-pound shells over 25 miles never fired at an enemy ship. The armour that could resist any gun afloat couldn't stop torpedoes and bombs delivered by hundreds of aircraft. The decisive fleet engagement never happened, because the enemy had found a better way to fight. In the end, the story of the Yamato is a cautionary tale about the importance of adaptation, about the dangers of institutional inertia, and about the human difficulty of letting go of beliefs that have defined our lives. It's a story about how hard it is to accept that the world has changed, even when the evidence is overwhelming, and it's a story about the tragic consequences when we fail to adapt in time. The Japanese admirals who couldn't believe the Yamato was sunk by planes weren't fools. They were men caught in the grip of a paradigm shift they couldn't fully accept, struggling to reconcile what they knew to be true with what they had believed their entire careers. Their disbelief was the death rattle of an entire way of thinking about warfare, a way of thinking that had dominated for half a century but that ended finally and forever on April 7th, 1945, in the waters of the East China Sea,